Now, welcome to another lightning response video where I will once again take a question from the comments and try to give it a somewhat quick response, though I'll probably fail at that once again. And this time that question comes to us from Beastly Arrow, who asked, "Hey Thor, I often hear people say that 10 to 20 years from now, the kids that grew up with the sequels will start to have a louder voice in the fandom, and that they will shift the narrative of those movies. Basically, they think that it will be the same as how the narrative of this prequels went from not so great to amazing in the eyes of many. What is your opinion on this?" And I think this is a rather tricky, multifaceted question to try and answer objectively. And as someone who didn't enjoy the sequels, I am going to try to be as objective as possible here. This isn't going to be another Thor bashes the sequels video, so either relax, I'm not doing that again, or I'm sorry to disappoint you if that's what you wanted. Okay, so initially, I do think that, sure, any kid who grew up loving the sequels or is growing up loving the sequels will eventually have a louder voice in the fandom years down the road, which, yeah, I do think happened, and maybe to a very large degree with the prequels. I think the kids of that generation have certainly helped its seeming rise in popularity or acceptance lately, and more on that in a second. But then I ask myself, how many kids actually grew up or are growing up loving the sequels, especially compared to how many grew up loving the prequels? How big of a splash will this current generation ultimately have? And I'm not saying it's virtually none. I'm sure there are plenty of kids out there who loved the sequels, but is it actually a lot, a sizable percentage of this younger generation? Or is this generation more about or more into Marvel and other things? Though yeah, you could certainly argue the prequel generation had Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and other things that they could have found more interesting than Star Wars. In other words, both generations, unlike the original trilogy generation, who had pretty much nothing to compete against Star Wars. Anyway, both prequel and sequel generations have had other things besides Star Wars to distract them. Though I'd argue the sequel kids have far more distractions than the prequel era kids did, thanks in large part to everything from YouTube to streaming networks to mobile gaming, and everything else that just wasn't around 20 years ago in the age of the prequels. But then I also ask myself, what's stopping the sequel generation from already having at least a somewhat louder voice in the fandom, considering there's nothing really stopping them from being on social media and fighting for their beloved movies to some extent already? And sure, many of them would still be pretty young for social media, or so I would think, but plenty are, no doubt, already old enough and able to be out there and leaving comments all over, and thus potentially fighting for and adding to the popularity of the sequels. And since social media is the barometer of something's supposed popularity, why aren't we already starting to see more love for them out there if the kids are indeed using social media? And I say more because, though some might ignore it or not see it because you're not exactly on social media every day looking for what people are saying about Star Wars, but there is actually quite a bit of positive stuff out there towards those films. However, I do think social media is, again, only a supposed barometer for a few different reasons, with the main one being people are far more likely to complain about and consume content or comment on content about people complaining, more so than they are to be out there proclaiming what they love and making videos about it. I mean, there are many channels here on YouTube who do nothing more but complain about something, and when people aren't so angry about that anymore, they then move on to something else to complain about. In other words, for better or worse, people who are angry tend to be louder than people who are happy. But at least when it comes to something like entertainment, I'd say that anger tends to cool down and fizzle and fade away faster than someone's love or enjoyment of something does. Love tends to remain constant over time, whereas anger and hate tend to be hot at first and then cool off. Which isn't to say that I think the quote-unquote sequel haters are just a loud, angry minority. I think they make up a pretty sizable percentage of the fan base, or maybe former fan base. Only that, yes, there are plenty of fans out there who enjoy the sequels who, shall we say, have just silently existed, or who have been out there quietly praising them and just not making the same waves as the quote-unquote haters do, or they're just too young to be really using social media just yet. In fact, I do think all this begins to explain, as I was saying before, this sudden supposed mass acceptance of the prequels, which I'm not saying hasn't happened to some degree, or maybe even a pretty large degree, only that, to put it simply, hate for those movies has become something more akin to apathy. It's not like a great many of the people who didn't like them once upon a time have changed their tune as much as they've pretty much just stopped singing. They don't care anymore or have long since stopped fighting against those films because no one, even people who really hate those films, no one really wants to waste their time and energy complaining about them here 20 years after the fact. For example, or to hopefully better explain what I mean, every time I make a video that involves, to some degree, bashing the sequels, there are plenty of people who make a comment about how it's been like 3 years already, dude, and you're beating a dead horse at this point and it's time to move on. Or some will say they're just done, they just don't care anymore, one way or the other. They don't even want to listen to people bashing them anymore. They are out. Which is all fine and good, don't get me wrong. I do think it'd be sad if I or anyone else was making daily videos hating on the sequels at this point, or to even make it the bulk of my or any channel's content. That doesn't mean people are changing their mind or coming around on the sequels. Again, they're just done with the sequels entirely, and they've moved on with their life and their free time. But the interesting thing is, if I made a video praising, say, A New Hope, no one, literally no one, is going to be in the comments saying, dude, it's been 45 years since it came out. Can't we move on and talk about something else already? No one really ever gets tired of you praising something that they love, which doesn't mean a ton of people will necessarily even want to watch it, but no one's going to say stop talking about it already, even almost a half century later. Heck, no one would say a word if I made a channel entirely devoted to loving the original trilogy, or even made a channel loving the prequels. Yeah, you'd have some that would voice their dislike of the films here and there, sure, but you wouldn't have anywhere near as much dislike for them in the comments nowadays as you would if YouTube had existed back when those films were first coming out, and if I or anyone else was making videos praising them back then. Again, the hate for the prequels or the need or desire to express how much you didn't like them has faded for most, while those who loved the prequels are still loving the prequels just as much, and they're probably happy to hear less hate for them, which may in turn make them more likely to keep expressing that love. Which then makes it feel like there's been a radical shift towards them, when it's really just, to put it as simply as I can, and I could have saved you about 5 minutes here, there's just been turnover in the fandom. And so in theory here, 10 to 20 years from now, when the fans who are done with Star Wars because of the sequels and who were maybe once really angry and loud about how much they didn't like those films, well, they'll pretty much all have either long since moved on or just begrudgingly accepted that they exist, or just not want to complain about them anymore because they let the past die. And yes, I know some will want to bring up the Clone Wars animated series, which I do think was a pretty big factor for a couple different reasons, one of which being, sure, some fans, probably not a ton in all honesty, but some fans who didn't like the prequels ended up enjoying the Clone Wars and kind of came around to the prequels, or at least the prequel era, because of that show. You also have the generation that found Star Wars through the Clone Wars and then went back and watched and loved the prequels because of them, because the show is set right in the middle of the prequels and uses many of the same characters. I think that was actually a pretty brilliant move on Lucas's part, that the series kind of keeps, you could say, pulling kids back to the prequels who maybe were initially too young to watch them. It kept them sort of relevant with the next generation. Which, of course, isn't exactly happening with this current generation. Nothing is pulling kids these days back specifically to the sequels. They might be bringing them into Star Wars, but not, again, specifically to those films. The animated show Resistance was probably meant to do that, but since it wasn't very good, I'm sorry to say, it didn't pull that off and ended after a season and a half. And so instead of kids being, again, sort of pulled back to the sequels, we instead have The Mandalorian, which is pulling them back to, I'd argue, probably more so the prequels and original trilogy, though probably also the sequels to some extent too, even though there has been very little connection in the show to the sequels, with only some vague references or mentions to things in the sequels, like Canto Bight being mentioned, for example. At least vague connections, yet that could change down the road, and again done to bring future generations back to the sequels. And so in summary, yeah, you'll probably see a different attitude towards the sequels in the years to come, though I honestly don't know if they'll be as loved and as embraced as the prequels are now, simply because I think Mando is this generation's Star Wars more so than the sequels. I could be wrong, there could be an army of younger people out there ready to go to war for the sequels in a few years when they're old enough, but I really think they're more on the Grogu train than any character from the sequels train. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about all this, or to ask me a question for a future lightning response video. Just start your comment off by saying something like, "Hey Thor." Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.